This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and various different guests. Today I'm on my own again because I'm doing a kind of mini-series, I guess, on colour in the garden. It seems like a good time in spring to really be thinking about appraising your garden and are you getting the most out of it? And I do think colour is one of the most life-enhancing things you can have, whether it's an outfit you're wearing or your house or your garden. And so it seems like a really good moment in the year to have a think, could you make it any better? And it's worth listening back to episode 1 and 2 on this series, because in 1 I explain that I work with 4 palettes and each 4 palettes have 6 colours in, and I go through which they all are. And also we'll put those in the podcast notes. And in episode 2, it's really what atmosphere you want to create in your garden. And so which palette are you going to go for? And there are some practical things like shade that you should influence what you're choosing, but also it's really about a feeling. What feeling do you want in your garden? Now, this episode is really practical, and it's how to use my colour system in your own garden. And I've been looking through lots of garden design books recently, and I sort of feel if you already know what you like and you know that sort of classic English June garden look, which is, things like rosemary, roses, sort of nepeta, perhaps, catmint, alchemilla mollis, maybe some gara, it's sort of wafty blues, whites, a little bit of purple and green. So what I would call the washed palette, sort of drifting into some slightly more intense purples and blues. Then in a way, I don't think you need my colour rules because you know what you want, and you want a sort of classic English June garden look, and you're clear already in which colour direction you want to go. So I'm not sure this is for you, but maybe bear with me. What I feel is this is for the person who wants to kind of branch out a bit and experiment and play around with colour and with plants and combinations that you don't yet know. So I sort of feel it's for the person who wants to throw it up there and out there a bit. And as I said a lot in episode 2, it's about a feeling. And that's why the palettes are really about feelings. So whether it's washed, which is a sort of clean feeling, or whether it's velvet, which is an enveloping feeling, or whether it's comforting, which again is a sort of cashmere feeling, or whether it's luminous, which is a sort of joyful feeling, but it is quite a lot about feelings. So how to use this and to give you the confidence to throw things up in the air a bit, I am going to give you some methods. And the first thing that I would say is, particularly if you don't yet have a garden and you don't have access to a friend or family who has a garden that you love, which I'll come on to if you do, but I think coloured candles are absolutely brilliant for pulling together the palette and refining within one palette down to actually really what you want to look out at and be in and sit in your garden. And I have a box of coloured candles that I've sort of gradually collected together over the last decade or so. And it's funny, actually, sometimes Adam finds my box under my desk and I come into the kitchen and he's lit some of the candles. And I'm like, no, you can't use those. They're my colour palette candles. And I blow them out and put them back in the box because I can't necessarily get some of the more unusual colours. So whenever I see another candle that I don't already have in my collection, I add it and I don't burn them. I use them. And do you know why? It's because they have a kind of density and a volume of colour, which is much, much, much better and more relatable to garden flowers than, say, a colour swatch, which is, sort of 2 or 3 centimetres long and a couple of centimetres max across. And then it's surrounded by white. And white is, as I explained in the last episode, such a noisy colour. So you're not really seeing what you're going to see, because in your garden, you're going to be seeing these colours, not against white, but probably against green, or perhaps against some crimson or whatever, if you've got crimson foliage plants. But so I find coloured candles really, really helpful. And I've since read that various painters actually used skeins of wool when they're working out a palette, or they would paint a big block of wood and then play around with that so that it's a more realistic thing. So yeah, it's interesting. I think that is a really good sort of practical way of working out a palette, particularly in the winter. But definitely, there's no doubt that if you have a garden, or you have access to a garden that you're allowed to pick just a head of this or that from a flower of this or that, then walking round and deciding a palette in your hand, putting together flowers in your hand, will be the most realistic thing of all. And I'll explain exactly how I have done that and how I do it, and then taking a photograph of it so you've got a record of it. And so that's the best of all. And what I would say is, there is one other way, which is obviously the most common way that people do, which is you create a mood board, a Pinterest board, and you really start to collect together plants either cut out from catalogues, or now that's kind of quite old-fashioned, just doing it on screen if you want. I still love the physical thing. So I do tend to stick things on pieces of paper and have them and move them around. But that is obviously the most sort of conventional way of doing it, and it works. It works really, really well. So those, in terms of practicality, is a kind of some ways I would start approaching it. But also, I want to break each of the palettes down to individual colours a bit more. And so you've got the 4 palettes, and I'm hoping if you've listened to the first 2 episodes, you will know or have a good idea of which one you're going to choose, or possibly which 2 you're going to choose. Now, what I want you to think about is within that palette, so have it in front of you and have the candles or, whatever in front of you as a reference, and then choose 2 colours from that. And this is the most simple way to start. And within those 2 colours, for the first colour, which is the one that you want to dominate, choose 2 flowers initially, just 2 flowers. One flower is big and blousy and showy, and what I call the bride. And the next is the same colour or as matching as you can possibly get, but it's smaller and it's less sort of showy. And that's what I call the bridesmaid. So the bride is the pivot of the day and the garden, and the bridesmaid backs her up and doesn't compete with her. She's her support act. And then I would choose something almost as contrasty as it can possibly be. And this is where the colour wheel may come in to help you if you don't know instinctively what will give you good contrast. And that is what I call the gate crasher. And the gate crasher is, I think of it, if I was cooking, it's like adding lemon juice to a lot of things, or salt. It's a sort of enhancer. So let's just go through some examples. So let's say I was working with the luminous palette. So let's say I've got an orange tulip, and then I've got an orange wallflower. And then I'm going to add in an early flowering purple allium. So I've got orange big, orange small, purple big. Okay? Or in velvet, let's say in the summer months, I've got amazing velvet crimson rose, like Tuscany or Tuscany Superb. And then I'm going to pick a really beautiful clematis that is the same colour or similar, like Étoile Violette. And then, and this is a perennial mix, I'm going to thread something through in a kind of burnt orange, like Tumbergia African Sunset. So I've got bride is the rose, bridesmaid is the clematis, and the gate crasher is the Tumbergia. Okay, I won't go on through all the different recipes, but you get the point, which is that you've got the dominant flower as the bride, the secondary flower as the bridesmaid, and then almost as dominant as the bride, but slightly less of it in terms of volume, in terms of number, is the gatecrasher. And then from there, you can just expand out. So once you've chosen your bride, you've got your bridesmaid, you've got your gatecrasher, but then I could add 6 bridesmaids. You know, I've got one bride or possibly 2 in a border. So like 2 matching dahlias, but they're different. And then lots and lots and lots of zinnias, again, in very harmonious colours with those brides as my bridesmaids. And then through the border, I've then got some contrast. And so let's say I've got a big pot of petunia. Like if I've got orange, I've then gone for, let's say, a crimson petunia for contrast. So bride, bridesmaid, you can have lots of bridesmaids, gatecrasher. And you could have several gatecrashers, but you're not changing your colours. Okay? So that's the key thing, really. And you can then haze at the edges, and you can, like when you're adding another ingredient, you can have something slightly paler, you know, and something slightly stronger, but you're staying with those 2 colours. So tonally, they might change a little bit, but the 2 colours remain the same. So every time you're thinking bride, bridesmaid, gatecrasher. So whether it's a pot of tulips in the spring or a container of dahlias in the summer and autumn, but you're doing exactly the same. And just to reassure you how easy that is, when we did our colour cutting garden at Chelsea in 2017, we had various people, Josie and I and Arthur Parkinson and Caroline Neville, who we work with. We'd all done this before, but we had various people who hadn't on site. And I could just stand with them at the beginning of the day because we had different volunteer planters each day. And I could just say, right, just go bride, bridesmaid, gatecrasher. And off they'd go. And to start with, I'd say, if possible, bring them to show us before you plant them. But, you know, really, really quickly and easily, they were away. They just knew that recipe. So like it could be an amazing lupin we used a lot called Beefeater at Chelsea. And that was match, which is a lovely, rich red, carmine, sort of crimson. And then we used a really nice, similar matching coloured cosmos, a dwarf variety called Sonata Carmine. And then the gatecrasher was an orange lupin called Terracotta. Or we used Salvia viridis blue along with Delphinium blue, and then a Euphorbia as the contrast, Euphorbia schillingii as a contrast, as the acid green. So blue, acid green. And it was just so easy to explain and roll out. So I really, really promise you that works unbelievably well. Bride, bridesmaid, gatecrasher. That's really colour. But there are a few other things that you need to bear in mind when you're putting together a border plan. And I'll draw all this together at the end. So the next is succession. So colour, you've decided your palette. You've broken down your palette, bride, bridesmaid, gatecrasher. And then you've got to think of succession to get a really successful garden design. And what I mean by that is, what is the main posse of plants that are going to hold the colour baton in your palette? And so I would really recommend that you break your year down into 4 chunks. Well, it's 5 really, but 5 is winter. So 4 chunks. And the first chunk is March and April. The second, surprise, surprise, May, June. The third, July, August. The fourth, September, October. And then we'll forget about the rest because there isn't much going on really. Okay, so when you're thinking about your palette and succession, then what is going to hold the colour baton in the relay race? So you've got to think that your garden is at the Olympics and someone at the beginning, when the gun goes off, has the baton in their hand, and that person has to run to the next person and hand that colour baton on to the next family of plants without dropping it. And then runner 2, which is May, June, has to run, and they have to hold the colour baton and hand it on to July and August, and on it goes, yes? And now I literally think about it like that. And what I do is I draw out the new garden that I'm designing or putting the colour together for, and I have a thick black Sharpie drawing. That's probably on graph paper. And then I overlay that with tracing paper. And the first layer of tracing paper that is stuck on the top is March and April, the next May, June, And what are the plants in that season that are holding the colour pattern? Because you need some dominators. So you need some brides that are harmonious together, that work in the palette. You need some bridesmaids and you need some gatecrashers. And I promise you, if you do it like that, and then you do the next season, and then the next season, but it's not season as it is, the next 2 pair of months. But if you do that, you will see, and some plants will flower so long that they'll appear over 2 of those chunks of months. And that is, in a way, it will really help concentrate your mind on the really long performing plants. And that is always the thing here, is that we try and notice when something comes into flower and then when it goes over. And even if that means a bit of deadheading, it's still really, really massively worth noticing those things. And so we have, certain plants like Euphorbia Caracias wolfenii or John Tomlinson that we know starts flowering in February and goes on flowering until the end of April. Incredibly helpful, even into May. So that is a real stalwart for us. And then another plant that we rely on hugely here is Amelanchier. The Amelanchier, small tree shrub, which we have multi-stemmed. Again, really, really helpful because it has such a long performance. So it has beautiful, beautiful coppery leaves in the spring, then flowers, then berries in June, July, and then turns the most beautiful colours in the autumn. So it's a really long performer. So that sits in a planting plan and will perform maybe slightly different tonal colours, but it will perform across all those seasons. And then obviously this is where things like Gara, the family Gara, is such a good performer. Comes into flower in June, carries on flowering till November. So that will appear right the way through, various of those bi-monthly chunks. Salvias, similarly. So it's really having enough of those stalwart, long flowering plants and working out if you want oranges as one of your colours or if you want coppery browns as one of your colours, what is going to give you those colours over that whole season to be that strength of message in that particular palette. Do you see what I mean? So that is the second most important thing, I think, to getting a really successful colour garden. And all I would say is scale is obviously an issue, but I'm sort of taking that for granted, really. You're not going to plant a pansy next to a sunflower, are you? Because they're not going to work because they're working on a different scale. So for succession, black and white drawing, March and April together, May and June together, July and August together, September and October together, and just sitting down at the planning stage and really working out which of the plants are going to deliver you, exactly the colour, the tonal colours you want from one month to the next, and which are the constants and which are the changes. And bulbs, of course, are incredibly important for that March-April season. And for me, dahlias, I happen to be fanatical about them, but they are also incredibly important from July right the way through until November. So, almost every one of my planting plans will include at least some of those. But just before I finish this and move on to the first of the palettes and the episodes where I'm going to run through one palette at a time, I just want to take you through an exercise that I did myself in the garden here last October. And I found this really helpful because I realized it actually is how it makes all this most usable. And so what I did is I was doing some teaching in the Surrey Hills in the middle of October. And the garden obviously is beginning to, get a bit thin on the ground, or flowers rather, at that stage in the year. So I went out and I thought, right, what's my starting point? Well, I decided I wanted to do the sort of soft, warm cashmere palette, which I call comforting. And I wanted to do a really whopping great vase in that palette. So I went out and it was the middle of October and I'd really fallen in love with this rose in the summer months called Sweet Honey. And sweet honey is, how do I describe the colour? I never know how to describe that colour. It's kind of, I don't know, people call it peach, but it's not the colour of peach because it's got much more pink in it. But it's sort of the colour of labyrinth dahlia as well. Anyway, it's that sort of peachy, pinky, kind of very soft, gentle, romantic colour, but not straight pink, not cool pink. It's much warmer. And oh, wow, that is a cracking rose. So it had been in flower in the summer and it was still in flower in the middle of October. And I was able to pick really genuinely 60 to 70 centimetre stems, very, very thorny. So I then stripped the thorns off the stems. So that was my starting point. That was my bride. And from there, I knew exactly where I was going because I followed my recipe. And so off I went and I found 2 dahlias, which were almost matching, but a little bit less showy than the rose. And the first is a really popular variety called Peaches, which is the same colour but has a slightly paler petal edge. And then a brand new one to us, which is called Schnickerstein, which we had to trial here this year and we all absolutely loved. And it had a remarkable vase life of 7 to 8 days, which is really amazing. So I knew I could take that off on the road for a week and it would be okay. So I had my brides and my bridesmaids. And then, because I didn't have quite enough of the dahlia, I actually ended up picking an astro called Indian Summer, which is also very long flowering, which has the same sort of apricot-y, peachy colour, whatever we're calling it, with some crimson in it, which I quite liked because it sort of calmed it all down a bit and stopped it being a little bit too sugary sweet. And then I needed the contrast. And for that, I went to another alstroemeria, which is an incredibly brilliant variety called Blushing Bride, which flowers from May until November. So then all I needed for my vase was foliage, and I picked Abelia grandiflora, which is just utterly, crazily, utterly brilliant plant, which I've gone on a lot about on the podcast, because it looks good 12 months of the year, and we use it a lot here, and I pick it a lot in the autumn. I used Hydrangea Limelight, which again I've gone on till I'm blue in the face because it's such a good plant, and Stipa gigantea. And do you know what? I did the vase and I loved it so much. I said to Josie, who was with me, Josie Lewis, our head gardener, I'd love to plant that as a whole border in the rose garden. And we're going to. So that's what I mean, is that is how you play around with flowers in your hand. And in this case, I then put them in a vase and live with them for a week. And then I'm now going to design the whole border around exactly those plants. I may add in a few other things, but those are the basis. So I've got a rose, which is my bride. I've got the dahlias as my bridesmaid and an astro. I've then got an astro as my gatecrasher. And then I've got 3 wonderful foliage plants, a hydrangea, an abelia, and a Stipa grass that gives movement. Brilliant border plan. And that is really being led by the palette, being led by the colours, and then thinking about form and thinking about succession, because all those are really long flowering. But that is exactly how I would suggest that you do it. But you can break that down to something much simpler. So, as I said, bride, bridesmaid, gatecrasher. So 3 flowers and then maybe 3 foliage. You've got a border plan. You've got a simple border plan. With me, I ended up with 9 ingredients, but you don't need to. And that is how it becomes incredibly untheoretical but practical, and you can use it in your own garden. And so next week, I'm going to start going right the way through, palette by palette, week by week. So if you're somebody who's drawn to the luminous palette, then join me next week. If you don't want that, skip next week and move on to the velvet palette the following week. But I will run through the 4 palettes and give you the plants I really recommend month by month for each palette. So if you're doing your black and white drawing and then you've got your tracing paper, you can take notes and really actually make use of it in your own garden. So I'll see you then. Thanks very much for listening to Grow Cookie to Range, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven. And next week, I'm on my own again, carrying on. So episode 4 of my mini series on colour. And I'm going to start concentrating on the first palette, which is the luminous palette, which I described in episode 1. And I'm going to really give you what I feel are the most important plants for that palette, the really reliable, long flowering, easy to grow, high performers. And I'm going to also talk about a succession. So which are the plants that I would recommend you grow for spring, which for summer, which for autumn, to give you a really maintaining of a high colour pattern in this particular palette. And so which of the families and down to varieties in some cases will really help you garden the luminous palette. So see you then. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.